Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to do is first talk about some conceptual underpinnings for what I see as a relational process. And then I'll talk about some problems with teaching culture historically, or not historically, presently, and then present a curriculum for teaching culture dynamically, and then some student outcomes and reflections from a curriculum that we've designed along with my colleague Elise Petit. I'd like to acknowledge here. So, okay, some problems with teaching culture historically is that language and culture have often been separated in the language classroom, where focus on grammar and vocabulary as decontextualized pieces have been treated separate from culture, which has sometimes been treated as being carried through literary works or as an inventory of behaviors or lists of differences, for example. So this is not ideal because this fragments culture and language and also keeps culture as very static kinds of notions. So culture as a relational process, for me, is informed by some of the following notions. So, for example, coming to terms with one's own position as a culturally situated subject, learning some cultural general and culture-specific skills and strategies for interaction, or understanding culture as something that develops through so-called traffic and significant symbols, or my favorite, and I'll come back to this, participation in a particular culture is involves linguistically mediated membership into a discourse community. So where language and culture are automatically one and the same. And another notion then, looking at the individual as a semiotic system, quote, that is, as a set of meaningful choices about the presentation of self. So culture provides a context in which this semiotic is to be read, and choices will be understood differently in different cultural contexts. All right, so okay, some problems with teaching culture. Well, number one, beliefs by students and instructors about the place and role of culture in the language classroom, separate. And many studies have given treatment to this idea, or standards, and how the separation of communication and cultures automatically sets up a distinction between these two notions, with communities also being completely separate. And again, lots of work on this area. And of course, the problematic textbooks. Now, I'm not picking on these are symbolic images here. But seeing textbooks as carriers of cultural fact automatically sets up culture as a static concept that can be transmitted. The kinds of tasks then that follow from this are information recall type tasks. The teacher is seen as a transmitter or purveyor of culture. So these are problematic in that there are one-way views to sort of one-way singular static views that are promoted through textbooks. So several studies have been done around this work, and these are particularly interesting in the way that they look at how certain language forms have been eclipsed. Etienne and Sachs, 2009, look at the way that formal variants are favored over stylistic variation in a number of French textbooks that they reviewed. Shartikova and Pavlenko, 2004, looked at the way that the identity of Russian speakers were promoted in Russian as a second language textbook. Chappelle, 2010, looked at the eclipsing of Canadian issues and identity concerns in French textbooks. So, and then finally, Wenninger and Kiss have talked about the way that textbook images often are just supports for language, but that activities do not necessarily invite critical reflection on those different modes of communication in the way that we've just heard from Neil Johnson, the way that different modes organize meanings in different ways through different commitments and different logics, and critical reflection on the types of images that are present, or the ideologies that are represented are not necessarily always reflected. So coming back to this idea of culture as being in discourse communities, a couple of notions that go along with this for me, and this is very foundational to the curriculum, which I'll talk about in a minute. So within discourse communities, of course, there are common values and ways of expressing the world, but also variations, some normative cultural practices and conventions. But discourse communities are not monolithic. These are not entities that map onto national context, right? There's quite a bit of variation within and between. We're members of multiple discourse communities, our identities are implicated, and some memberships might be chosen, some might be given, and these are all part of various our participation in different discourse communities. So with that, this is the curriculum that I'll describe. This is a global simulation curriculum, and I'll explain what that is, for a 4th semester French course. So the end of a required language sequence, using a genre-based approach and through a pedagogy of multiliteracy. So I'll explain how these different pieces contributed to the organization of the curriculum and the engagement with ideas, and then we'll look at the student outcomes. All right, so global simulation is a pedagogical framework that originally started in France in an L1 learning context, but that has been developed and used, including by several in this room who have done global simulation projects. And it essentially involves students taking on the role of a character, providing a context for meaningful interaction in creative ways as they decide what their characters do and say in response to particular communication situations. So we set this global simulation in the 17th district of Paris with full recognition of the problems of picking a context, right, and potentially reinforcing ideas that French is Paris. But did this kind of strategically based on context that we were familiar with, and also that would resonate with students and align with the university study abroad programs and be a little bit more coherent in terms of other peripheral programs. So these are some of the characters, just a subset of some of the characters that the students chose for themselves. Now, these are not the participants. I'll come back to kind of a participant profile later. But you can see that the ages were quite varied. Some were male, some were female. Some students, female students, took on the role of males, vice versa. Some non-traditional older students took on the roles of 20-year-old students, and their tasks essentially were to carry out communicative activities through the voices of their characters. So in order to socialize the students, or the students as characters, into the particular discourse communities that would hopefully allow them to see and interact with different cultural meanings, we designed a progression of texts and themes across the entire semester, starting with some foundations, language and communication, talking about stereotypes and identities, and then moving toward private sphere, or so-called primary discourses, drawing on work by James G., Hiram Maxim, then towards secondary discourses, public sphere, and these are some of the topics that were addressed. Many of the examples that I'll talk about relate to this module on work, life, and leisure time. So this was about week 6 in the curriculum, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay, so with those themes, we selected a number of texts that would help students get different takes on different ways that, say, work life was talked about, or the concierge, or secularism in the context of France. So recognizing that texts are not just information sources, but they're to be understood in the context of their context of production and their multiple interpretations. One of the goals that we had was to find a range of texts that would come at these different issues with different voices from different perspectives, and then we structured the tasks so that students would reflect on them in various ways. So some of the sample texts in the unit on work life and leisure time was a video report on individuals' views of the 35-hour work week and how they spent their free time. So different voices interviewed in terms of what they were doing with their extra time. An infographic on how I'll say French people spend their free time, or the most preferred activities. A news report with various quotes that are presumably spoken language written down. So essentially what we tried to do, as I said, is find texts that would provide different takes on different aspects of work life and leisure time. We structured the activities through the 4 curricular components, drawing on the New London Group's work and subsequent work by Cope and Calancis, where different activities invite different kinds of engagement with texts. So a situated practice activity might be sort of initial immersion in the text, describing, observing. Overt instruction would be a little bit more meta awareness on how language forms and meanings interconnect. Critical framing are more reflective, sort of comparing, synthesizing, critiquing. Transformed practices then actually producing or demonstrating and creating different meanings in a productive way. So going back to the texts, some of the activities that we did, for example, an overt instruction activity with this particular text and the different voices, we had students work collaboratively on a Google Doc with a matrix where they had to identify different features of language, so sentence length, punctuation, register, word choice, and analyze different ways of expressing meanings, enthusiasm or not, and opinions around the 35-hour work week. Now, this text in and of itself, by virtue of the fact that it presents different identities and ages and takes, I think had some kind of an impact on the way that the students approached this particular topic. All right, so this text in the course we used as a way to look at another take on different types of leisure time activities, different from the kinds of leisure time activities that were presented in this video, which were primarily going to the gym, working out, going on vacation, taking organized holidays, whereas here we see things like surfing the internet, watching TV, etc. I'll add a parenthetical note, and parenthetical only because it doesn't relate to the research outcomes. It was done subsequently, and that is that an example of a critical framing type activity with this text could be to have students go investigate the source of this text. So found scope, look at the methodology and how these numbers were derived. And doing so essentially demonstrates that the data comes from a survey that individuals could choose to take, and the survey was disseminated on this very website where the data was produced. So surfing the internet, 72%, probably no surprise if those who were taking the survey were on the internet. So inviting different kinds of reflection on text rather than just mere flat sort of description and using linguistic language to describe flat or static realities invites different kinds of knowledge about cultural practices. So one of the other things that we did along with this, and this sort of fitting in with the multiliteracy's perspective around inviting reflection on learning and on texts, We did a pre-module reflection where students reflected in English on their own practices before each of these different topical modules. And then a post-module reflection that had a little bit more to do with comparing cultures and also questioning underlying values underneath these cultural practices. So some sample reflections. Describe the life of a concierge or a gardien as you understand it from the different texts we've read in class. What advantages do you see, disadvantages? Why do you think this profession exists in France and not in the US? So thinking about underlying values and how those relate to practices. Describe what you know about the 35-hour work week in France. What cultural values do you think this policy decision reflects? So these kinds of questions I'll add were designed to get students to reflect, and there were really no answers that we were looking for, right? So they're written hopefully open-ended enough that students would demonstrate something new, a new awareness, a new discovery, but not necessarily something fixed. All right, and then what are the major differences between the overall structure of government in France and the US? Do you think that the particulars of each country's system of government have an effect on civic engagement in each country? All right, so these are just some sample questions. What I'd like to do is now come to sort of a summary of the different curricular elements before showing the student outcomes. So again, the global simulation invited this awareness on how my identity might determine how I might choose to respond to a particular communication situation. Genre-based curriculum presented different text types across the topics, and the 4 curricular components from the multiliteracies framework guided the way that we structured students' engagement with those texts. All right, so the data that I'll show comes from basically a discursive analysis of what students wrote in their reflections, taking a qualitative socio-constructivist approach. So how do students understand and represent culture learning at the end of this semester-long global simulation is the question that guided this inquiry. So this is not a real participant, again, also symbolic, but the students in the class, I would say, were primarily traditional aged undergraduate students of different ethnic backgrounds with the exception of 1 or 2, and where there might be an identity factor that I, as a researcher, think might be important in the interpretation of results, I will add that in at the end discussion. So the data sources came from the students' reflections, primarily in their culture showcase in the portfolio and in their final portfolio reflections. So the quotes that I'll show come from students at the end of the semester. There were 33 different students' sets of reflections that were analyzed in this process, but of course I won't show them all. I put that in there because I want to show what the sort of primary themes were across all of those students, and then we'll look at a couple of examples. So these were the themes that essentially emerged from the analysis of that set of reflections. So number 1, when asked to talk about culture learning, students still talked about language learning, and notably in terms of separate skills development and accuracy of form. 2, culture learning was construed as a relational process. In other words, there was some demonstration of cross-cultural perspective taking. 3, students demonstrated understandings of culture as dynamic. 4, students continued to construe culture in stereotypical ways. 5, students expressed surprise about the content and object of learning in the foreign language classroom. And views of culture included genre as culture and the importance of culture in language. So now I'd like to look at a couple of specific ways in which I interpreted students' comments to reflect these general themes. So this particular student Cameron says, this global simulation class was good in helping me understand French culture better, but now I want to turn my focus to really developing my speaking abilities, and I believe the next class will do that very well for me. So clearly a student who saw and continued to see a distinction between language and culture. Great, but let's get back to the important stuff. Jennifer said, by reading a French book comprised of short little stories about life, we were able to see from a French point of view and accurately analyze the literature. It gave us ideas of French life, French daily life, and immersed us more in one by reading in French. This also worked on our writing skills and abilities to communicate with each other. So she's seeing language learning and meaning making as different skills and development of skills. And also looking at literature as reading literature as an activity in which one gleans accurate cultural information. Okay, Patricia said some assignments, such as Le Portrait d'Immigrant, which was a website where we looked at different portraits of immigrants from many, many, many different countries over time, helped me in practicing my French listening comprehension from videos. We asked students to engage with all of the modes of communication on that site, which included written language, images, videos, audio clips. But this, by Patricia, was construed as a listening comprehension activity. Okay, so these skills included improved French writing, as I've practiced writing the most throughout the semester. I've also learned some new techniques to better understand spoken French, such as trying to understand the overall meaning of the spoken text rather than every single word, etc. So she's very focused on individual skills. Ellen, in talking about culture assignment, the students were asked to do their interpretations of French culture through a multimodal voice thread. And she says, this assignment was a positive activity for me because I was able to express myself in the French language without too many errors. So focusing on accuracy. Carla hones in on this notion of perfect pronunciation and vocabulary. Again, these were in areas where students were asked to reflect on their culture learning globally. All right, so number 2, culture learning was construed as an interpersonal relational process. Cameron said here, adapting the role of a character allowed me to step into somebody else's shoes and view things through their own eyes. Too often we get stuck in our own interpretations. This is Monica, and she, I will say, was an international student from Mexico and was already, I think, attuned to from the very beginning. So I don't want to claim necessarily that the course developed students' perspectives on these areas, but the interaction of activities in the class between the texts and the characters and the variability and the comparisons, I think, invited some of these reflections in a way that a more static course may not necessarily do. So Monica, it was particularly reflecting on the way in which understanding an individual's situation. This was a woman about whom we read who was reflecting on having to take off her headscarf before going to work. And Monica's reflecting on the way that essentially our contexts influence how we perceive various situations. Chelsea, taking a slightly different tack, says, in order to do well on this assignment, I not only had to understand laïcité or secularism as a whole, but I had to understand it from the French perspective. What I think is most interesting about this particular quote is that she says, if I would do this assignment over again, I would have tried to touch more on specific issues, and I have to think back to my own culture. So she implies that she not only is she using her, or she's aware that she's not only using her American perspective, but also makes reference to acknowledge that she understands that these things change over time. Tina is a student who was from a Vietnamese family that immigrated to the States, and in many of these interpersonal reflection processes or reflection tasks, students were asked to reflect on their own versus other cultural practices. And she said, I chose this activity to demonstrate how culture defines our own life. This activity made her aware of her own cultural background as somebody from an immigrant family and the way that that influenced her interactions in relationship to the world. Okay, 3, students understood or demonstrated understandings of culture as a dynamic process. So Ellen here is reflecting on the fact that some might want to have the 40-hour work week, but others enjoy their free time. So she's making kind of a general remark. Patricia gets a little bit more specific. Patricia played the role of a medical student in the global simulation. That was her character. And she reflects, this activity also made me realize that French people may have different opinions on this cultural practice on their professional status, depending on their professional status. For example, my character is not the biggest fan since she's studying to be a doctor and they have more work hours, not impacted. So this allowed me to learn more surrounding this issue. So she's thinking about the variability of the fact that there are different perspectives, and everything really depends. So some students continue to construe French culture in stereotypical ways, focusing on culture as architecture. Erin says, I love this assignment. I didn't know much about it, but I love French culture and architecture, and this for her is what defines culture. So some of these historical notions of culture remain very rooted in students' perceptions. Ellen also focused on architecture. Getting to number 5, students expressed surprise about the cultural content in the foreign language classroom. So Cassandra reflected that unlike in high school, I learned about French politics, which is something I never thought would be necessary in order to learn a foreign language. But what we had done was, in trying to sort of simulate this context, we built part of our curriculum around giving students some background on different political parties so that they could understand mayoral elections in Paris that were happening at the time that the second iteration of this course happened. And so this was a very strategically placed module in the curriculum. Michael reflected on the way that, again, politics was very unusual for the foreign language classroom, but was very aware of how that helped understand that politics is part of cultural process. So I want to just demonstrate the way in which culture and language were reflected upon differently before I conclude. And that is Michael, again, who was thinking about language and words like socialist and socialiste and how these terms don't translate as dictionary definition equivalents. He says the nomenclature of this party alone allows the American reader to make a number of assumptions. The concept of socialism bears different weight in France than in the US. This historical and cultural framework of France allows for a political climate in which socialist parties are not viewed as dangerous or even radical. Okay, so he's making several interpretations that might or might not stick, but essentially is reflecting on language. The last quote, Monica says, I learned that the word laïcité cannot be translated. Essentially, the notion of secularism and laïcité are motivated by different underlying values and have different instantiations in public space. So what I'd like to conclude is, or I'd like to conclude by just sharing some implications for language teaching, and there are probably many, many, many more. Students are very susceptible to discourses of language learning. Obviously, on some level not surprising that they were very reflective of language learning as a separate skill set and not culture. In terms of implications, we might be stuck with our textbooks, but what can we do to engage students with the texts and images and materials that are there present for us? Can we invite different kinds of dialogues? Can we bring supplemental materials that bring in different voices on those texts? again, I don't want to claim that the reflections from the students that I feel were very positive in terms of their learning were necessarily a result of the curriculum, but this dynamic curriculum brought out some of those realities. And finally, in terms of something that I would do differently or more in the next time I would do something like this, would be provide more spaces for students to share their own work with each other as a result of their engagement with different interpretations, different productions. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
You have time for questions?